Welcome back to the Stories of Northern Life podcast, brought to you by the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I would like to tell you the story of the Old Stone House and Charles Oakes Ermatinger. Before we start, remember to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to, and share with your friends so we know that you like what we are putting out there. Now, let's get into it. The Ermatinger Old Stone House will always have a special place in my heart, as it is where I discovered my love of history. I took part in a summer camp there when I was 10 and started volunteering a bit after. And the next summer, I went back and volunteered again, and I guess I never really stopped. I got all my high school volunteer hours there. I also worked as a summer student for 4 years, and now I am a reenactor. In fact, you will be able to see me there next week for their annual fall rendezvous, and that's taking place from September 25th to the 28th in 2024. History comes alive as we tell the stories of the people who lived during the time of Mr. Ermatinger. So, who was Charles Oakes Ermatinger? Well, he was born to Swiss immigrant Lorenz Ermatinger and Jemima Oakes in either 1776 or 1780. It's not entirely clear. He was born and raised in Montreal and had 7 siblings. His father and uncle, Forrest Oakes, were both fur traders operating out of Montreal. His father, Lorenz, helped to form the Northwest Company. Charles entered the family business, and he seemed to have operated mostly as an independent fur trader. He began by traveling to Sandy Lake, Minnesota in 1797 or 98. He met with Chief Catawba Beta of the Sandy Lake Ojibwe people, and he married Catawba Beta's daughter, Mananawi, à la façon du pays, meaning verbally without clergy. In 1800, the Northwest Company hired Ermatinger as a clerk with the understanding that in 5 years he would become a partner. But by 1908, he had surrendered his appointment as partner, but perhaps he was forced out due to slander. It's not entirely clear why they broke ties. Once again an independent fur trader, he moved his family, which included Mananawi, and his 6 kids to Sault Ste. Marie. They settled on the North Shore or the British side. He began by building a family cabin and then other log buildings for his fur trading business. He was caught up in the War of 1812 and helped in the capture of Fort Michilimackinac. Also during the war, he began to build his grand home. Construction began in about 1812, and then when the Americans came through in 1814 to burn the Sioux, Ermatinger managed to convince them that he had no ties to the British and his home was spared. This very elegant home is constructed of local red fieldstone and was built between 1812 and 1814. Mr. Ermatinger, being a wealthy man, would have been able to afford to hire builders from Montreal to construct his home. The house was built in 2 sections. The lower floor was built from 1812 to 1813, and the upper floor was built in the subsequent years. From the outside of the house, there is evidence to suggest that there was time in between the 2 stories. The second floor is constructed of smaller and a little bit darker stones than the ones that were used for the first level. Also, the second story floor joists are sloped. This was found during the reconstruction of the home when it was being turned into a museum. It may suggest that a temporary roof had covered that level. The house is supported by large peeled cedar logs around 45 centimeters in diameter, which can be seen in the basement. The exterior walls range from 75 to 90 centimeters thick, providing natural protection against the elements. The original floors are 5 centimeters thick, 15 centimeters wide, constructed in the double tongue and groove style. In 1814, when the house was complete, Mr. Ermatinger traveled to Montreal with his family to find furnishings for his house and to conduct business matters such as hiring employees, acquiring more trading goods, and enrolling his eldest children in school. Charles was always enhancing his home by having furnishings shipped from Montreal or made by local craftsmen. They built a small summer kitchen behind the house, as was common at the time, since kitchens were a huge fire hazard and they did not want to put the main house at risk. He had cleared land to farm, maybe about 26 acres of his about 200 acres of land, and he had workers who maintained not only the farm but the fur trading operations. He had 13 children in all, though only about 7 of them did survive to adulthood. In 1816, he became an agent for the Hudson's Bay Company, though that only seemed to last until about 1820. So that was right before the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged. In 1821, Ermatinger launched a remodel of the interior of his home. One of the items he purchased was a 3-foot double stove with 3 back ovens. Now, Ermatinger's wife, Meninawi, or Charlotte, would have had a much easier time preparing the feasts that Charles hosted. At the same time, he was also building 2 stone towers, one for a gristmill powered by a windmill, and the other an inn-house. The following year, he began to seek a proper deed for his land, as the military certificate he was granted did not seem sufficient. He, and later his son, Charles Jr., would fight for years to obtain a deed. Ermatinger was famous for his caribou dinners. People from both sides of the river would be invited. He hosted Mr. Johnson and his family, the Schoolcrafts, the officers from Fort Brady, which is now Lake Superior State University, John Silverwright, and Dr. John Bigsby, to name but a few. In 1828, Ermatinger and his family left the Sioux and moved back to Montreal as the fur trade was drying up in the region, leaving him little business. Now, for you remember from the podcast last week, you remember me talking about how after the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged, the Hudson's Bay Company started using the northern routes. So Sault Ste. Marie started to fall by the wayside, and we can see that with Mr. Ermatinger. So he retired from the fur trade, but his new home in Elmwood was situated on a farm, so he was able to continue that practice that he picked up here in the Sioux. The house was left with a few furnishings in case any of the family wished to stay there on their travels, and Joseph Lafond was left to care for the property. By 1830, Charles was in ill health. On September 6, 1832, Charles and Meninawi, or Charlotte as she was referred to in English, formalized their marriage in a church ceremony in Montreal. However, not quite a year later, on September 4th, 1833, Charles Oakes Ermatinger died, and Meninawi would follow him 17 years later in July 1850. Charles Jr. continued to petition the government for the deed to the property in the Sioux, but he would have to pay. He instead sold the property and transferred the deed to David Pym. After the Ermatingers left, there were numerous other residents and uses for the home. In 1833, William McMurray, an Anglican missionary, came from southern Ontario to serve/convert the Ojibwe people. He married a daughter of John Johnson. McMurray and his wife built a church and schoolhouse for the Ojibwe people. If you remember my episode from a few weeks ago on Anna Jameson, you will remember that she visited Mr. McMurray in 1837. She later recorded her visit in her book, Winter Studies and Summer Rambles in Canada. Mr. McMurray, not being able to convert the Ojibwe, left Sault Ste. Marie in 1842. The house continued to sit vacant after that. In 1852, David and Margaret Pym bought the house, converted it into the Stone House Hotel. During this time, many well-known people visited the area, often staying at the hotel. In 1856, Mr. Pym received a deed for the house and land. He seemed to receive it fairly easy and quickly compared to the struggles both Charles Sr. and Jr. had. In 1858, he became the postmaster of Sault Ste. Marie, causing the post office to be moved from the old Hudson's Bay Company building to the Stone House Hotel. Richard Carney, the first sheriff in Sault Ste. Marie and stipendiary magistrate, arrived in 1858 from Owen Sound. He and his family lived in the Old Stone House. In 1858, the city of Sault Ste. Marie was made capital of the judicial district of Algoma. When Colonel John Prince, the first judge in Sault Ste. Marie, came to the area in 1859, he made the house into the first courthouse until a new one could be built. The new courthouse opened in 1866, where the present one stands. The two rooms on the west side were used as courtrooms. Upstairs, they would gather to decide the accused's fate, and the summer kitchen that stands there now was actually built over the site of the holding cells for those who awaited trial. The Carneys continued to live on the second story of the Old Stone House. William Carney, son of Richard, followed as the second sheriff and lived in the house until the early 1900s. Following the Carneys, the house was used by the YWCA, that is the women's version of the YMCA, so the Young Women's Christian Association, as a meeting hall and boarding house for young ladies. In the 1930s, it was purchased by A.F. Hamilton and became a social club, including a tea room and dance hall. In the 1940s, it was converted into 4 apartments and used as such until the city purchased the property in 1964. Restoration on the house began at this time, and it continued until 1970, when it was designated a historic site. And at this time, it was called the Ermatinger Old Stone House. One of the main reasons this house was actually designated as a National Historic Site was due to Mr. Ermatinger's contribution during the War of 1812. And now we're going to be talking about the War of 1812 in next week's episode. The Ermatinger Old Stone House is still owned and operated by the City of Sault Ste. Marie and administered by the Historic Sites Board, but it now is called the Ermatinger Clerg National Historic Site, as it not only holds the Ermatinger Old Stone House, but also the Clerg Blockhouse. So once again, if you remember from last week's episode, you remember me talking about the Northwest Company post that was first burnt down by the Americans in 1814 and then reconstructed in 1819, while the one gunpowder magazine was still standing when Francis Hector Clerg came to the Sioux, and he built his home on top of that, and it is now the blockhouse. So the Clerg Blockhouse stands right beside the Old Stone House. So if you want to learn more about Mr. Ermatinger and the Old Stone House, take a visit over and visit this museum, watch the movie, and be immersed in history. So thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you stay tuned.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might like our blog too. Head over to our website, Sault Museum, that's SAULT museum.ca, and look under Discover. You will find our blog, Museum Musings. We share short synopsis of influential people, historic places, and impactful events in our history. Pictures are always included, and you will be sure to learn a little something new with each post.
Hi, I'm J.L. Fizzell, and I write and publish poetry inspired by nature and the art of being human. These are some of my words. One of the things I love more than poetry is story and storytelling. And I've always really loved nature because I spend time thinking about the kind of stories that nature could tell us if we could speak the same language or speak its language. So this particular poem is about stars and stories, and you'll find it in my fourth book, Human Nature. It's called Infinite. I know now that these stars rent their place in the sky, and I can't help but wonder the price or why they choose to do so. Even these ancients are finite, only leaving stories behind, and when those words become forgotten, they become feelings on the wind, the ones you can't decipher, telling stories you know off by heart, but could never put into words. I hope this poem took you somewhere inside yourself that you needed to go. You can listen to my story here on the Stories of Northern Life podcast. Links are in the show notes.